Hello from London. First, let me congratulate you, SU Gender, as you've now become, formerly Gender Forum, Centre of Excellence at Sabanci University. Congratulations on organising this wonderful conference on such an important topic, gender and peace, and doing so despite the troubling and difficult times in Turkey and worldwide. When I first learned of the plan to name this conference as being in honour of Cynthia Cockburn, my first reaction was to throw up my hands and say, no, this is totally undeserved. I mean, just look at the names on the participation list for this conference. All of you gathered here this weekend. Simply to be associated with you all as a conference attender, that would be an honour in itself. But then I tried to imagine what might have been in the minds of Ayşegül and Begum and Betul and others among you who had chosen to flag up my work in this way. And then I understood that, of course, the honouring this weekend, in reality, is of the many women whose gendered activism for peace I've had the honour of writing about, of documenting, over the last 2 or 3 decades. First, we're honouring today 100 or more women I could name in 3 countries: Northern Ireland, Bosnia, and Israel-Palestine, who feature in a book I called The Space Between Us, where you see them inventing and practicing a methodology of feminist transversal politics by which to reach each other across the dangerous terrain of civil war. Next, in the island of Cyprus, we're honouring a group of brave and persistent women coming together from Greek and Turkish sides of the militarised partition line, working for a unified island. Then there are the several hundred other women, and some men, I've met in Colombia, India, Uganda, Sierra Leone, and half a dozen other countries, all of them activists in a worldwide movement opposing violence and war. Among them are Turkish activists, because I've several times visited Istanbul, Ankara, and Diyarbakir in these years of travel. I'm thinking particularly of women of the former Amargi here in Istanbul, of Pinar Selek and Yasemin Oz and Nil Mutlua, among others. 2 of them are now in exile for their pains. I hope they know we're thinking of them. So I want to begin my few words today by saying these are the many women, and some men as well, to whom, in featuring my reporting of them, this conference is rightly dedicated. And on their behalf, I want to thank you, SU Gender, very warmly for that honouring. So, in the few minutes that I'll be speaking, I want to address the connection between the gender relation and violence and war, as I've learned it from those peace activists. It's they who have led me to propose that gender is causal in militarization and war. Not just that gender is associated with violence. It is, of course. We see it all along the continuum of time, in time of peace, in time of war, and the continuum of scale, from the blow of a fist to Donald Trump's mega bomb on an Afghan bunker. Gender helps us to see the contiguity, the connection between instances of violence. But we can go further. We can, I believe, say the gender order as we live it has been one of the causes of the prevalence of violence in society throughout history. The reason I think such a theory has been slow to evolve is due to the post-structuralist, postmodernist turn in the 1990s, which seemed for a while to make it impossible to use the concept of patriarchy. Patriarchy became an outdated structuralist notion. However, I was hearing feminist anti-violence and anti-war activists boldly continuing to use the word. I remember when I was in Okinawa, it would have been around 2010, Naoko Ikeda and I were visiting the women of OWAM, Okinawa Women Act Against Military Violence, OWAM. The people of Okinawa are deeply burdened by militarization. 3/4 of the massive US military presence in Japan is based in these small islands. The place is groaning under the weight of military hardware. And then there's the demand of the American soldiers for, quote, rest and recreation, which means access to women's bodies. OWAM was set up 20 years ago in response to an episode of rape by US Marines. And they became a well-respected part of the mainstream peace movement of Okinawa, opposing the Japan-US Security Treaty, the AMPO, they call that treaty. So the women of OWAM, they will join an anti-AMPO protest against a massive threat of violence like a US nuclear submarine docking in a Japanese port. And at the other extreme, they'll condemn as a weapon the fist, or the erect penis, if you like, of the individual perpetrator of violence against women. Security is a word with a very big meaning for these women. Suzuyo Takasato is one of OWAM's founders and a key activist. Talking to Naoko and me, she used the word continuum to stress the link between these different scales and kinds of violence on the islands. And she went on to cite system, in quotes, and patriarchy. The military is a violence-generating system, she said. Patriarchy is a violence-generating social order. So, like a lot of other activists I've met, like Ida Santos in the Philippines, like Marina Gallego Zapatas in Colombia, Suzuyo was not afraid to use the difficult word patriarchy, when many academic feminist theorists were avoiding it. It's they who gave me the courage to persist in using it in my search for causality. I think of it this way. As feminists in this postmodernist era, we stress the notion of intersectionality to describe relationships at the individual level. In an intersectional approach, we see any one individual as positioned in and shaped by several intersecting power relations. For a start, those of economic class, of ethnicity, and gender. A white owning class and male individual has a different life experience from a black working class woman. But where do we look to see the source of such power relations? We surely have to look upwards and outwards to those society-wide structures. Okay, let's call them meta-processes. That sounds less rigid, and it recognizes that they're capable of changing and gradually developing over time. The two big ones, the economic system, deriving power from wealth, and the racializing power of ethno-nationalism in tribes and nations. These two, at least, are surely undeniable. But right there, intersected with them, in every human institution, in every corporation, every church, in every family, is a third power system, the sex-gender order, which, with minor modifications, appears to have been for millennia one in which men have exercised power over women. Patriarchy for short. Together, these systemic processes produce inequalities among us as individuals in the here and now. And we can go further. All three of these power systems are intrinsically violent because it takes force to constitute the self as an inferiorized, exploited other, the landless labourer, the despised minority, woman as man's property. People don't submit willingly. So together, these power processes cause interpersonal violence, strife, militarization, and war. Gender isn't the sole cause of war, of course. It's not often an immediate cause, but it's an underlying cause, a predisposing factor, making the use of force always a likely choice. I've chosen to see this theory of gender as causal in militarization and war, as a standpoint in the Marxist sense. That is, an understanding of the world generated by a particular collective social actor in struggle. For Lukács and others, the, quote, proletarian standpoint was the theory collectively derived by the working class from its experience of struggle in labour. Nancy Hartsock has persuaded us of the idea of a feminist standpoint in women's labour. What I'm suggesting, furthermore, is that women may be understood as collectively deriving a feminist standpoint from our gender-specific experience of and struggle against violence in all its forms. Now, our conference organisers asked me to say in this talk what I think is most needed at this moment, what our activism and theorising right now might need to focus on. Well, I like to listen to Raewyn Connell in Australia. She writes, quote, "Given the concentration of weapons and the practices of violence among men, gender relations appear to be strategic. Masculinities are the forms in which many dynamics of violence take shape. Evidently," she says, "a strategy for demilitarization and peace must include a strategy of change in masculinities." So, yes, I agree. That's the first thing. We have to make the shaping and reshaping of masculinities a policy issue. And for that, you need a much more widespread grasp of the proposition of 20th century feminism that gender relations, masculinities and femininities, are not determined by genes. They are not destiny. They are socially shaped in the family, in education, in culture and law. We can act to change them. They are subject to policy. Well, for that to happen, the man behind the weapon, the masculine predominance in violence, sexual and otherwise, needs to be much more visible. Now, I know that sounds ridiculous. Male violence is all around us. Surely it's visible. Look at the UK national crime statistics. 95% of all violent crimes in the UK are committed by men. In the case of sexualized violence, it's 99% of crimes that are committed by men. What could be more clear than that? And yet, somehow, those gender-skewed statistics of violence don't get nearly the attention from policymakers that you might hope for or expect. One of the feminists who taught us about social gender was Anne Oakley in her book. She called it Sex, Gender and Society. Way back in about 1970 it was published. Now, she's a neighbour of mine in North London today. And recently we've compared notes on our newspaper reading. we both noticed how often a news report, let's say a report from a city like Birmingham, on an epidemic of sexual abuse against women and children, let's say a report on that, we both noticed how often a news report like that will make reference to the women and children victims, yes, but then it will speak of the abusers, the perpetrators, and so on, in gender-neutral terms like that. Their sex not actually specified. No mention of the words man, men, or masculine. It's implicit, of course, the man as the perpetrator, but he's too often taken for granted and not clearly stated. It's kind of coy, invisibilizing of the sex of the offender has a serious effect, because the policy that is prompted by such an article, by such an epidemic of abuse, deals only with the victims. The authors will call for better protection of women and children. You never read or hear, quote, "What is it with men? We must reduce the violence of men and boys." You don't hear that. Okay, so that's the first need, I think. Our second need, I feel, is to do more work on theorizing the growing number of men and women who contradict the stereotypes. We are seeing today a few more men doing caring work and quite a lot more women leaders. Look at Merkel, Theresa May, Marine Le Pen today. Even our newly appointed Commissioner of the London Metropolitan Police, the biggest police chief in the country, is a woman. Cressida Dick is her name. This would have been unthinkable till recently. Now, some people are arguing that these developments undermine feminist theory about male dominance and so on. But we know we can expect Cressida Dick's experience in the job of Commissioner of Police to be different from what her male predecessor experienced. Just as research has shown that women soldiers have a different experience from male soldiers, and male rape victims from women rape victims, etc., because they don't escape dominant gender power relations. They continue to be framed within them. Okay, so theorizing that, I think, is a need that we have. The third need I think I'd pick out is for more men to become gender revolutionaries. Women have learned to oppose violence not just as people, but as women in our gender identity. We need men to do the same. We need them to engage as men, resisting the complicity, the exploitation of masculinity for war. Turkey's been leading the way in this. Ayşegül Altinay and others here have taught us all how Turkish boys are traditionally reared in soldier mode. And we've seen some Turkish men turn this gender shaping on its head. Conscientious objectors, refusing military service, rewriting masculinity as they challenge the state. In the UK, we have very few and very small groups of men supporting each other in refusing violence. One group that joins us on the streets sometimes is called White Ribbon. We need many more white ribbons. LGBTI activists are going to contribute hugely to achieving all three of the developments I've sketched above. They're growing in number and are having an ever greater impact as a social movement. There can be no better starting place in unchoosing violence than shaking and breaking the tyrannical gender binary. So, enough from me. Thank you for giving me this chance to contribute to what I know is going to be a fantastic and inspiring exchange of ideas this weekend. and a recommitment of energies, I'm sure. I'm terribly sad not to be able to be there with you, but I'm hoping to get texts and recordings of everything you say. Have a wonderful 2 days.